I think America must see that riots do not develop out of thin air. But in the final analysis, a riot is the language of the unheard.
There's a joke that goes like this. A pedophile, a wife beater, a rapist, and a Philly cop walked into a bar, but he had to leave because there's no drinking on duty. Now you might say that's a very, very harsh joke. But the fact is, this department is currently under a federal consent decree, and this department is well known for their brutality, their incompetence, and their police chief with a very ironic name of Outlaw.
Ironic!
Indeed.
And she was brought in to make things better when, based on media reports from states that she previously worked in, she promoted an environment of police brutality.
She's a fine, pig is what she is.
Which is like having your father go to jail for abusing you, and then your stepfather using a grenade launcher whenever you misbehave. Boy, oh boy, the swinery here is strong. So sit back and grab your favorite drink, and let's take a deep dive into the Philly Police Department murder pigs. The Philadelphia Police Department, also known as PPD or Philly PD, was established in 1854. It's the 4th largest police department in America, and also the 6th largest non-federal law enforcement agency in the US. As of 2020, they had an annual budget of $774 million.
That's kind of expensive.
Which is darn near close to $750 million.
I want a full refund.
Their police chief is Danielle Outlaw, and much like Danielle Outlaw, this department has been riddled with a history of police brutality, intimidation, and a complete disregard for the constitutional rights of citizens. Some people have said that Danielle Outlaw taking over the Philly Police Commissioner position is the equivalent of giving the Joker the Infinity Gauntlet because you think that Thanos is too brutal.
You wanna know how I got these scars?
Was it the police?
And as harsh and as hyperbolic as that may sound, you will find that this description is not only accurate, but it matches the history of abuse coming from the Philly police chiefs that Philly residents have been telling me about. Now we know for a fact that Danielle Outlaw promoted an environment of police brutality. But what did the 4 police commissioners before her do? Well, we can go down a list. Danielle Outlaw was hired in 2020, and before her was Christine Couture, who was the interim Philly police commissioner from 2019 until she had to go, and Danielle Outlaw was hired. Now you might be asking, what did Christine Couture do to deserve to not have that job?
My inquiring organ wants to know.
This headline kinda says it all. It's from the Philly Mag, and the headline is, if Christine Couture had been photographed wearing a swastika, she would have resigned already. Philadelphia's acting police commissioner wore a shirt 25 years ago celebrating the racist police culture she now wants the city to believe she can help resolve. We are far past the point of giving second chances.
Yikes.
And now you might be thinking, how bad could this photograph have been? Well, it turns out that in 1994, she was wearing a t-shirt that featured the words, quote, LAPD, we treat you like a king, end quote. And that was a reference to the brutal 1991 police beating of a black man named Rodney King.
Yikes.
So apparently, this woman wanted to reform the police.
I have my doubts, serious ones.
While also celebrating police brutality. I don't know about you, but I have my doubts as to her ability to address police violence. And so did the city of Philadelphia, which is why we now have Danielle Outlaw. So how do we end up with somebody who before Danielle Outlaw would be so insensitive?
It's problematic at best.
Well, the Philly police commissioner that came before Christine Couture was Richard Ross, and he had to resign because, for one, he apparently couldn't keep it in his pants.
Former police commissioner Richard Ross, he is in the center of a federal civil lawsuit that alleges he knew of the sexual harassment but did nothing, and retribution for one of the plaintiffs ending a 2-year affair with the commissioner.
And 2, he was facing sexual harassment allegations and also racial and gender discrimination allegations within his own department.
Yikes.
When it comes to ruining both your home life and your professional career, this guy was the Deadpool of police.
Maximum effort!
And it turns out that when that woman and others came forward, this man engaged in retaliation against the people coming forward against him.
Yikes.
And so his tenure as Philly Police Commissioner was from 2016 to 2019. And the guy before him was Commissioner Charles Ramsey. Before Charles Ramsey was the Philly Police Commissioner, he was the chief of the Metropolitan Police Department of the District of Columbia, or MPDC, from 1998 to 2007. And he was the Philly Police Commissioner from 2008 to 2015. And this man's career has been riddled with controversy.
It's a bit of a mess.
Like, for example, the DC police engaged in unconstitutional spying on citizens, where the DC police would set up checkpoints where a citizen's data was just entered into a database, and those actions were so egregious that the police union involved called it a, quote, invasion of privacy, end quote.
That's putting it mildly.
On September 27, 2002, the MPD conducted mass arrests of protesters who were protesting the World Bank and International Monetary Fund meetings. DC police circled and enclosed more than 400 people, and without ordering them to leave or to disperse, those officers began to arrest those people, and many of those people were not actually demonstrators. Some were just journalists, pedestrians, and legal observers. And not only was this action clearly unconstitutional, on January 13, 2006, a federal court ruled that those arrests violated the Fourth Amendment rights of everyone involved, and that Chief Ramsey could be held personally liable for the violations. And that's a very important note to me, because that would mean that qualified immunity was not protecting Charles Ramsey, which means that he would have had to violate clearly established case law. And that case law involved objective reasonableness in relation to a Supreme Court case known as Graham v. Connor. In 2007, the District of Columbia agreed to pay $1 million to a group of more than 120 of the protesters. And that is not including every other settlement, which accounts for more than $600,000. And it turns out that Chief Ramsey, during the civil litigations, tried to throw his own officers under the bus because he claimed that he didn't give the arrest order. But one of his own detectives, whose name is Paul Hustler, testified in court that he overheard Ramsey say, quote, "We're going to lock them up and teach them a lesson," end quote.
He's a vicious scumbag.
Yeah, he is.
Now you might be thinking to yourself, wait a minute, if that detective and the commissioner are both giving conflicting statements, and those statements appear to be pretty specific, then wouldn't that point to someone lying?
One of these things is not like the others?
And wouldn't that also mean that someone clearly committed perjury?
Indeed.
And if you think that this guy was a pig, wait until you hear about the guy that came before Commissioner Ramsey. And that commissioner was Commissioner Sylvester Johnson, who was the Philly Police Commissioner from 2002 to 2008. And some of the headlines involved with this guy are pretty amazing. I mean, after all, this man has locked up many people, but it turns out that his own son is perhaps the one that Sylvester Johnson should have been watching.
Oh, it's true. It's damn true.
But the amazing part about this commissioner is that a Philly police officer named Charles Busaroni, who is a white man, came forward as a whistleblower against his own department, claiming that other white police officers were systematically targeting African American citizens. This man called for the resignation of the then Philly Police Commissioner, Sylvester Johnson. And so Charles Busaroni was fired. He took Sylvester Johnson to court for a wrongful termination suit. And in that court hearing, Sylvester Johnson claimed that he fired this man because he got into an argument with a superior officer. But we find out that the reason why he got into that argument is because some of his superior officers were racists who were targeting black people. And we now know this to be the case because this department is under a federal consent decree in the current day. And this story happened before the federal consent decree. So there's no reason to doubt this man if the stuff that he was saying back then turns out to be true right now. And I want you, the audience, to take a mental snapshot of what Sylvester Johnson said to justify firing a whistleblower cop. All it took for Charles Busaroni to be fired was to get into an argument with a superior officer. Keep that in mind as we go throughout this video. And that, ladies and gentlemen, are the 4 police chiefs that came before Danielle Outlaw. So I won't be too harsh on her because she just orders police brutality. But by comparison, her predecessors are daredevil villains. And let's be honest, the Philly Police Department and Danielle Outlaw don't need my help in embarrassing themselves.
Be honest, let's just be real.
After all, this department actually had a phone sex worker who was also a police officer at the same time. And I'm not quite sure how you make that work, because let's say you try to arrest a bank robber, right? Wouldn't it be kind of weird if you read off the bank robber's Miranda rights, telling them that they have the right to remain silent, but they keep talking and trying to pay you 99 cents a minute? This woman wasn't fired because of a policy loophole that did not prohibit police officers from engaging in such conduct.
What in tarnation?
And that is despite the fact that Philly police officer Tara Barrow was a phone sex worker, but she also ran websites featuring fetishes such as rape, incest, pedophilia, kidnapping, and snuff porn.
You don't want to be like this. This is disgusting. This is awful in every way.
Now you might be thinking to yourself, wouldn't that mean that this woman was catering to pedophiles?
Oh, come on, you've got to be kidding me.
You've had situations where Philly police officers have shot an innocent man and then accused that man of rape, where that man spent 19 years behind bars for something that he didn't do so that the Philadelphia Police Department could cover up their actions. That man's name is Tremaine Hicks, and that story sounds incredible until you watch this news clip.
Tremaine Hicks set free on Wednesday after 19 years behind bars. In 2001, he says he ran to an alley after hearing a woman's screams. He says he reached for his cell phone to call 911. That's when a responding Philadelphia police officer opened fire, striking Hicks 3 times. Officers said they caught him raping the woman, claiming he pointed a gun at them. And then you were arraigned and charged with rape as you were shackled to a hospital bed.
And I'm sitting there like, what the hell? No.
And let's not downplay what happened to Tremaine Hicks. This man spent the better part of 20 years as a convicted sex offender, which means that he was placed with other violent sex offenders and that his life was in danger while he was incarcerated. And the Philly police did this so that they could cover up the fact that they shot this man for no reason. Tremaine Hicks's liberty and freedom was unjustly taken away. And yet I guarantee you that me just talking about this will promote all the people who normally defend cops to make every excuse on planet Earth versus focusing on the fact that an innocent man was thrown in a cage with violent rapists in a facility that wanted him dead because they thought he was a predator. And as you're gonna see in this video, the Philly Police Department accusing anyone of being predators is what some might call the classical definition of projection. Other embarrassing situations include 10 Philly Police Department cadets who were dismissed from the academy because they were cheating on exams.
Just stop this, please.
Philadelphia police opening up a new investigation.
The incident involves a recruit class
into alleged cheating at the police academy.
On June 5th, it was discovered that one of the members of that platoon had obtained the answers to the test, which, by the way, would have been an open book test.
Wait, hold on. You mean to tell me that Philly police are so stupid that they gotta cheat on an open book test?
That exam part of the motor vehicle code was scheduled for the following day.
You had the Facebook racist post scandal, and that involved 13 Philly police officers who actually passed the academy.
It's time to stop. It's time to stop, okay?
June 1st, when the department became aware of the results of the Plainview Project. After data mining thousands of Facebook posts, some dating back to 2010 from police officers across the country, researchers identified 328 Philadelphia police officers who they say posted offensive content.
This police department has a serious issue when it comes to officers who have been accused, arrested, and/or convicted of rape, sexual assault, and/or some sexual-based offense. And if you don't believe me, well, I'm gonna throw some years and some names out at you. 2002, Christopher Skaggs was convicted of rape after he raped a woman while responding to a call at her apartment. 2003, you had 2 Philly police officers who was accused of raping a 25-year-old exotic dancer while they were on duty. James Fallon Jr. and Timothy Carr were both arrested, and yet later on, the criminal charges were dropped, which was a common thing to happen back in 2003 because, mind you, the George Floyd situation just happened. So many of these cases where cops just got off with rape were either swept under the rug or the charges were dropped. 2008, a Philly police officer named Thomas Gitto was found guilty of unlawful contact and of corrupting the morals of a 14-year-old girl. And this man was allowed to serve his prison sentence on the weekends. You know, because that's how you want to treat pedophiles. Give them the weekend warrior treatment. 2010, Malika Mebane was caught in a sex act with a female prisoner. And in case you don't know, prisoners cannot consent. And on top of that, the power differential between a police officer and a female prisoner is pretty clear. 2011, you had Keith Corley II, who was charged with rape, involuntary deviant sexual intercourse, indecent assault, sexual assault, simple assault, indecent exposure, and official oppression. He is said to have raped a woman in the back of his squad car. In 2011, much of the country learned about Raymond Evers, who was a Philly police officer who back in the 90s was arrested along with a man named Michael DeRita for allegedly gang raping a 19-year-old woman on a pool table at Temple University. The charges against Evers were dropped, but the DA involved in the case said that they believed the victim and was quoted as saying that the victim didn't lie. Later on, that victim committed suicide. You had Tyrone Wiggins, who was a retired Philly police officer and also martial arts instructor, who was found guilty of sexually assaulting a female student. And these assaults began when the student was just 12 years old and continued for 6 years. He was given 17.5 to 35 years in prison. Now, if we skip over to 2012, what we find is a Philly police officer named Anthony Detillo, who was arrested for abducting a 14-year-old girl and taking that girl and another 21-year-old woman to a motel where Detillo offered both the 21-year-old and 14-year-old $100 for sex. During the car ride, the 14-year-old texted family members stating that she had been abducted. When police arrived to the motel room, they could hear the girl crying. And then you have the disturbing story of a Philly police officer who raped a man whose name is Michael Page. The victim's name is James Harris, and James Harris is living with lifelong PTSD because Officer Page forced James Harris to perform oral sex on him in his police cruiser. And now you might be thinking, surely this officer was kicked off the force, convicted of rape, and never allowed to see the light of day again. And if you thought that, you would be wrong. Despite the fact that Officer Michael Page was arrested and fired in 2007, he was released from jail and got his job back, which would mean that this man got his job back despite the fact that DNA evidence demonstrates that he had sex in his car. And Michael Page was also not convicted because a judge accused Harris of playing the victim after, quote, consensual sex, end quote. And with just that statement, you start to understand what people mean when they talk about victim blaming. And don't you find it very, very interesting that the judge put so much onus on a person claiming to be a victim of a crime, but that same judge had nothing to say about a police department that keeps an officer on duty who has sex in their squad car. So this man faced no charges and was not even fired, and this is also despite the fact that a federal jury awarded $165,000 to James Harris, and I am sad to say that James Harris will likely never get justice, and Michael Page is allowed to walk free. Do you remember Officer Busaroni? Well, that man was fired for simply getting into an argument with a superior officer, but Michael Page, who is said to be a predator and who knowingly had sex in their car with DNA evidence proving that sex happened in that car, be it consensual or non-consensual, somehow keeps his job. And those two conflicting situations appear to show that the only way to get fired from the Philly Police Department is to question the rather questionable ethics of the Philly Police Department. Now here's 2013, and it shows a case of Leo Haley. He was arrested back in 2012 because he tried to lure an 8-year-old girl And that isn't shocking given the fact that he has a history of disgusting charges. In fact, in 2010, he was arrested on dozens of charges of CP and is also listed on Pennsylvania's Megan's Law website as having had disgusting contact with children. He also admitted to downloading CP through a file sharing network known as LimeWire. Now you might be saying, if he was arrested in 2010 and 2012, then why are you bringing him up for 2013? Well, the reason why is that in 2013, Leo Haley was arrested again for violating his parole by, you guessed it, going after a child. Now this next story you may or may not be aware of, but it involves a hero cop, threats to rape victims at gunpoint, and Barack Obama. In 2014, Richard DeCoatsworth shocked the country when he was charged with sexually assaulting 2 sex workers at gunpoint in May 2013. And it was also claimed that DeCoatsworth forced his victims to take drugs. He withdrew his not guilty plea in order to take reduced charges. And if you listen to how his lawyer talks about the case, you can tell you are dealing with a guilty man. His lawyer said, quote, he believes he is innocent, end quote. Now let me ask you a question. If your lawyer truly believed you were innocent, would they even word it like that? But what makes this case even more suspicious is that we find out that a friend of DeCoatsworth, whose name is Manuel Maldonado, went to one of the homes of the rape victims, knocked on that woman's door, and allegedly threatened to kill that woman at gunpoint if she testified in court against DeCoatsworth. Even the best examples of Philly police officers who are hero cops turn out to be scumbags no matter how you slice it. And then you had the case of Thomas Tolstoy, who was originally fired by Police Commissioner Charles Ramsey because he was accused of sexually assaulting 3 different women on 3 separate incidents while in uniform and acting as a Philly police officer. And now you might be thinking, surely this man was fired, and especially if the then Philly Police Commissioner Charles Ramsey wanted him gone. Well, if you thought that, you would be wrong, because Thomas Tolstoy got his job back because the statutes of limitations on the alleged crimes had run out, and that wasn't explained to the victims. And so Charles Ramsey said, quote, I'm stuck with a guy who shouldn't be a cop, end quote. Then you had Officer Ronald Johnson, who was a 26-year veteran of the force, and he was arrested in 2014 for the solicitation of a prostitute. He was suspended and dismissed. In 2016, a judge found Walter Sass, who was 77 years old, guilty of involuntary deviant sexual intercourse, aggravated indecent assault, sexual assault, unlawful contact with a minor, and other offenses. Walter Sass met that girl in 2010 when she was just 14 years old, and since he was a part of the Philadelphia Police Department's mounted patrol on horseback for 18 years, it made sense that he was giving riding lessons to other people, and that's when the abuse began. In 2017, Philly police officer Emmanuel Foley was arrested and charged with the sexual abuse of children, possession of CP, and the dissemination of CP. In 2019, you had a veteran Philadelphia police detective who was arrested and charged with 35 counts of sexual assault because he, quote, groomed and sexually assaulted dozens of young male victims, witnesses, and suspects throughout his 20-year career, end quote. And we know that he did this because in 2017, Philip Nordo was removed from the Philly Police Department because a defense attorney discovered that he had been depositing money into an account belonging to one of the witnesses that he was grooming. He would use threats and flattery in order to convince these young men to have sex with him. And what makes this worse is that he is also accused of using his position as a police officer, and specifically as a detective, to force people, but especially people who were suspects of crimes, to have sex with him. And then you had the case of Anthony Washington, who is a Philadelphia police inspector who was accused of sexual harassment by 4 female officers, as well as a student at Temple University who was just trying to interview him for a school project. And then when officers came forward about his conduct, he would retaliate against them. And what makes this story very ironic is that Inspector Washington oversees the Special Victims Unit. Now you might be thinking to yourself, if 4 female police officers has called this man a predator, and he was accused of sexual harassment before he even had a badge, and yet this man ever oversaw a special victims unit is the equivalent of making a fire-breathing dragon a firefighter. In the same year, you had Philly police officer Novice Sloan, who was terminated and also arrested and charged with sexual assault. And you also had an ex-Philly police officer who only got 1 year in prison for a violent sexual assault while he was on duty. Thomas O'Neill was given such a light sentence that U.S. District Judge Juan Sanchez said that he did so while holding his nose because, quote, the conduct here is extraordinarily reprehensible and incomprehensible, end quote. Thomas O'Neill confessed to what he did, and the only reason why he got such a light sentence is because of a technicality, because state lines were not crossed and the victim was not a minor. So even the U.S. Attorney's Office had limited power to intervene. In 2020, you had Sean Ronaldo Stewart, who was arrested and charged with heinous acts against a 13-year-old girl back in 1996, and that abuse continued until 1999. Stewart was 23 years old at the time. This next story has a headline attached to it that you might find to be incredible. And the headline basically says that the Philadelphia Police Department at one time was being sued by female officers every other month for alleged civil rights violations. Now you might be thinking to yourself, that isn't surprising because so far this department appears to be filled with criminals. But what you might find amazing is that this article mentions another story involving another Philadelphia police inspector whose name is Carl Holmes Jr., who found himself in court against a female police officer, and the city had to pay out $1.25 million to that female officer. And I gotta say, I have $0 million, and I'm not paying anyone a single dime for something that I didn't do. And now we come to the part of the video with the stories from this year. In 2021, you have Philly police officer Raheem Montgomery, who is a 20-year veteran of the force, who has been suspended, arrested, and charged with sexual assault of a minor. You also had Charles Young, who retired prior to his arrest. And the reason why he was arrested and charged with a crime is because he is accused of sexually assaulting an 8th grade girl. Young was a 21-year veteran of the department. And finally, you have the story of James Strom, who was arrested, tried, and convicted for sharing CP while he was on duty. Believe it or not, I have covered many aspects of police brutality throughout this video, but much of this video was focused around consent, and you can certainly see why. But what do I know? I'm just the devil in the details. Holy smokes, that was the longest deep dive that I've done in my entire life. That department is garbage, is trash. There's no reason why anyone in their right mind should trust police officers, especially in that city, after this video. But anyways, guys, be safe out there. Horns up, peace out. Good night and good luck.